Hi, I'm Hannah. This is Theology Therapist. Welcome. So today I wanted to talk to you about emotional support animals and psychiatric service dogs, a little bit about those. Connecting with people who are looking to be evaluated for ESAs or for assistance animals and writing those certifications. It's not something that I talk about a lot. It's really not something that I advertise because there are pros and cons. So today I actually wanted to sit down with you and talk to you about the pros and cons of assistance animals, because now it used to be emotional support animals. That was just the one thing that there was. And so I could have said support animals, right? And you would probably all know what I'm talking about. But I'll get in this later. The laws changed for airlines for psychiatric service dogs. And so ESAs are no longer allowed on flights. And so the new term, the new thing for airlines is psychiatric service dogs. So that's why when I reference these things, I'm going to talk about assistance animals, okay? So first, like I said, I'm going to start with issues and then I'm going to get to the good stuff. Just for clarification, right? So when I'm talking about an emotional support animal is an accommodation made by the Department of Housing and Urban Development under the Fair Housing Act, okay? And that essentially says that if somebody has a functional limitation to their day-to-day life, then they can have the accommodation of a support animal, an ESA. That used to also be the case for airlines. The Department of Transportation, under the Air Carrier Travel Act, it used to allow for ESAs as well. What happened is that in January of 2021, the law was updated and was changed. And the change was controversial in and of itself. What it did was it essentially gave the power to airlines to decide whether or not they were going to allow ESAs on flights or not. And unfortunately, all major domestic US airlines chose not to allow ESAs on flights, but the new designation is a psychiatric service dog. So that means that it is specifically for dogs, not cats, not rabbits, right? Like it is, airlines are saying dogs are okay. The difference between an ESA and a PSD is a training requirement. So airlines with the PSD now require that a dog be trained to pass what's called the public access standard. It's a list of behaviors that they need to be able to perform in a public and crowded space and to perform a task specific to helping a person manage their psychological symptoms. That's a rough breakdown of the differences between an ESA and a PSD. So an ESA, the Fair Housing Act, said this is for the place where you live. So it's not saying for hotels, Airbnbs, etc., right? That they're not legally required to make that accommodation. Same for airlines. The PSD, that is specifically for airlines. It's under the Air Carrier Travel Act, right? And so that means that public transit, that, I don't know, renting a car, things like that, they're not legally required. Or supermarkets, cafes, restaurants, all of that, not legally required to make that accommodation. A PSD and an ESA is not the same as like a seeing eye dog, for example. Like that's kind of like, I think there's some maybe miseducation or misunderstanding about what it is and what the accommodation allows for. So I just want to start there. That's like a base of what they are and what the accommodation allows for, okay? ESAs and now PSDs are quite controversial. This is because the law leaves so much gray area for tenants and landlords in the case of ESAs. The controversy around it means that many or most medical or mental health professionals or providers will either refuse or are unable, due to agency policy, to write a certification letter, either due to lack of education, like their own, like what is it and what needs to be in this letter, or due to liability reasons. If you have ongoing providers, some medical or mental health, like some are going to be willing to do that, especially if they know you well. So if you've been seeing them for a while. But if you're thinking, I need to go find a therapist, or I need to talk to my primary care doctor about having them write a letter so that I can have my dog stay with me because we have such a bond, that, in my experience, is going to be unlikely. It's going to be really hard to find someone who's willing to do that. If there is a dispute that arises between the two, between the tenant and the landlord, it is unlikely that there will be legal recourse in the individual case. One, due to the gray area, and two, due to the time that it would take for this to happen. For example, in most cases, it may make more financial sense and really like for time purposes to come to an agreement with the landlord and break the lease instead of pursuing legal action. And in my experience, this is usually what happens when a conflict occurs. Okay, so criteria for an ESA. I already alluded to it, but in order to meet criteria for an ESA, you have to have a functional limitation to your day-to-day life. So that could be working, concentrating, caring for yourself, sleeping, interacting and communicating with others, right? These are all is what is defined as a functional limitation. Honestly, this criteria is so easy to meet because of how generic it is. What does not meet criteria though is to say, I go everywhere with my dog, I need them with me, we have a bond. I mean, I'm a human, I get that, but doesn't meet criteria as a functional limitation because you have to be experiencing difficulty in your day-to-day life for those basic activities due to mental health or psychological symptoms, distress, right? So having a bond with your animal doesn't cut it. So there has to be a connection between the animal in question and the reduction in symptoms that the person experiences. Now, not every animal can be an ESA, okay? The law doesn't specify this, but you are going to struggle to find a clinician or a doctor who is willing to write a prescription or certification for an ESA for your pet peacock or snake or etc. And some of those outlandish animals are one of the big reasons why ESAs get a bad rap. Now, important to note, a diagnosis is not a federal requirement for an ESA, but some places are starting to request or require a diagnosis as part of their sort of additional verification process. So a lot of those places happen to be universities. They're always going to be more invasive into your privacy, and universities are more and more requiring or requesting a diagnosis, and it's within your right to know that that is not a federal requirement for an ESA. So if this happens, it is within your right to refuse to answer or to leave blank what a diagnosis may be. But if you do this, you have to know that they may be more predisposed to refuse your request for an ESA. And here's where we bump up against the gray area for emotional support animal accommodations. In this instance, there is really not much you or the clinician can do. And that's why this gets kind of controversial and just messy. An ESA is more of a statement or prescription for or about the person requesting the letter than it says about the animal itself. Now for an ESA, unlike a psychiatric service dog, for an ESA there is no formal training requirement, although it is strongly recommended. What is a requirement for an ESA is that an animal cannot have any incident of aggression towards other animals or people. So that's not just biting, that means growling, sort of excessive or that aggressive type barking, showing teeth. There's more to aggression than just sort of biting or attacking. And so a dog, an ESA is a responsibility, and it's saying something, even though it's not about the dog itself, it is saying something about the dog. And so they can't have any incidents of this happen. I already mentioned to you a difference in the psychiatric service dog, which is the training requirement. Now, the public access standard, you can find this online, what that actually is. There are dog trainers now who are starting to train dogs for this, but something like a canine good citizen, that generally covers and is more than sufficient as well. But generally speaking, public access standard is a dog needs to be focused on you, needs to not be vocalizing, so barking and growling, can't be pulling on the leash, and it can't be engaging with any other person or animal. Even if it's friendly engagement, it's not allowed. Some examples of tasks. So remember, it has to perform a task to help you manage symptoms, and it has to be trained to do that. Some tasks could be tactile stimulation. When you're feeling anxious, it could be deep pressure. It could be creating a social buffer or like barrier. It could be reminding you to carry out daily routines. Maybe you've trained your dog to remind you to take your medication, or your dog initiates desired social interaction, or your dog wakes you up in the morning, right? Like these are all some of those actions, right? Those are actions, those are tasks that it does that your dog can be trained to do. Now, there is no formal testing or certification process, and the training does not have to be done professionally. You don't have to go and pay for a professional dog trainer, because this would legally, federally, they cannot require that, because this would limit access to this accommodation. So the training can be done personally, but do know that if you are, like in the instance of a psychiatric service dog, if you are saying, and airlines will have you fill out a form, if you're saying, yes, my dog is trained personally, like I did the training, you are making that statement to the federal government under penalty of perjury. So the change came last year in January of 2020 away from ESAs for airlines, because they put the onus back on the owner, on the handler of the animal, okay? And so know that there is this understanding federally that your dog has been specifically trained. And so that's the other thing about a psychiatric service dog, there is an understanding that you are receiving psychological treatment. It doesn't specify what that looks like, none of that, but you need to know that those are things that you are attesting to whenever you sign those documents for having a PSD with you, okay? This was some of the specifics about ESAs, about PSDs, and with some of their cons. But let's pivot now and let's talk about some of their pros, okay? Now, for my clients who have experienced a traumatic event, an assistance animal can be huge, and it can make a complete difference in their ability to function on a regular basis. Assistance animals often understand social dynamics, and they can create a social buffer between the client and other people that gives the client additional space that they need to feel safe while interacting with others. So, the dog can will often maybe place itself between you or between the person and other people that they're interacting with, and it might even lean on your legs, might even put pressure on your legs. So that's one way that it can provide a social buffer. An assistance animal can also sense when your stress or your anxiety are running high, and they often become more attentive through physical touch and presence. This means that when a person is in public, the assistance animal can sense your arousal, and they may tend to lean against you, like I was mentioning, or they might stand near enough for you to pet them, or they might even lead you away from the social interaction that was causing that distress. So a lot of times panic attacks also accompany PTSD, and an assistance animal can be trained to lay on top of your chest. It can be trained to apply pressure to different areas of the body and give you the space, give you a little bit of a break from those hyperarousal symptoms in order to calm your breathing, to calm your heart rate, and essentially to distract you from those panic symptoms by focusing on the assistance animal and on that touch, on that pressure, on that stimulation that they're giving you. An assistance animal can also provide or create a sense of safety, especially if a person finds themselves in a scenario similar to the traumatic event often, right? So think being at home, alone at night, subway, things like that. So if you have an assistance animal with you, they can really create a sense of safety instead of needing to be on guard all the time. Someone who has experienced a traumatic event may begin to avoid social interactions and isolate themselves. An assistance animal gives you the opportunity to engage in social interaction in a way that feels safe and comfortable for something that you might not otherwise do. Often this acts like exposure therapy, so the more you do it, the easier it gets. Now, I would just say that by and large, one of the biggest pros of an assistance animal is the purpose that it creates. The responsibility that you have to get up each day and to take care of itself, because then you have this felt sense that you need to take care of yourself and be giving yourself the attention that you need to do because it depends on you to care for it. It can be really difficult to engage in social or work activities with PTSD, but the purpose that you feel with the assistance animal that you have can push you to keep working when you would otherwise let these responsibilities drop. So negative perspective and outlook can be negatively impacted by a traumatic event, and an assistance animal can remind you that there is good in the world and that you are loved regardless of what has happened, no questions asked. And that is invaluable. If you think that you or someone you love would benefit from an assistance animal, maybe an emotional support animal, maybe a psychiatric service dog, you can read the description for more information on how to follow up. Remember before you go to click subscribe and stay up to date on all weekly content. Thanks. See you soon.